Welcome back to episode 3 of Bob the Butcher. Bob Berdella, a serial killer in Kansas City. You just heard Troy Cole, the sergeant who was in charge of the investigation, talk about going into Bob Berdella's house. This is it's a really creepy, scary story. Welcome, Synova Cantrell. She is our resident psychologist, and what would we call you? You are like the mind bender.
I'm an armchair. I call myself an armchair profiler. There you go.
All right, you're our profiler. Gonna help
A
explain
wannabe.
some of this, because Sonoma, these things are confusing to outsiders. You're not.
Yeah.
I mean, you need to have somebody needs to do some study, and
Yeah.
that FBI profiler that went in penitentiaries. We were talking about that a little bit before we started recording, about going in and interviewing these guys to find out what was in their mind in order to psychoanalyze them, because they seem to have some repetitive behavior, these different serial killers. Not a lot of the details are different, but there's some things that are the same, and Bob Berdella has one of those. We're going to talk about it in just a minute. First, guys, I want to recap episode 2 and 1, really, and where we're up to now. There's a man named Bob Berdella lived out in a neighborhood called Hyde Park in Midtown Kansas City, and we ended the last episode with neighbors in this neighborhood, Hyde Park, were kind of surprised when a naked man wearing only a dog collar and a chain appeared at their door. And I think a meter reader or something was walking down the street about that time, and he's greeted by this naked man with a dog collar and a chain around his neck yelling for help. And it's a quiet neighborhood. This kind of stuff doesn't happen. And they're working couples and new families. These houses were all built around the turn of the century, and so people are moving back into the city during these years in the 80s, and they're fixing these houses up, and because they have this beautiful wood and interesting layouts, and you can get them pretty inexpensive back then. They're pretty expensive now. So they call the police, of course, and cops that respond to the call find this terrified, incoherent man who tells about a story of being held prisoner in the house right across the street from where these people are that called the police. And he said there was a man named Bob Berdella, and he kind of knew him, and the neighbors confirmed, yeah, that was the man's name. Now, the cop's first instinct, and this is usually your first instinct as a police officer, is this is just some crazy sex games that went askew, and somebody got a little out of control and started out consenting, and maybe it ended up not so consenting. But it's not like a stranger on stranger kind of crime, because this guy seemed to know Bob Berdella, and the neighbors said, yeah, well, I know him. He has a business. He owns an antique business really just over here about 8 blocks away, and this flea market was really popular. He's active in the neighborhood association, and he's kind of strange, but we know him. So the officers, they're not sure what to do. They call their sergeant. First thing you do is call your sergeant. Sergeant gets there, says, call sex crimes. It's a sex crime. If there's any kind of a crime, it looks like there's a sex crime. So call sex crimes. And then one of you guys take this victim to the hospital, and the other two wait for Bob Berdella to see if he comes home. They just, sit down the street. You wouldn't really have to hide, because it was not unusual to have a marked police car sitting in the neighborhood during these years. And a detective, the sex crimes detective, meets the officer and Christopher Bryson, who is the man who's had the dog chain and collar around his neck. He meets them at the hospital, and they calm him down, to get him away from the scene and calm him down. The staff is starting to work on him there. And the detective came to believe that this was, at the very minimum, a kidnapping and a forcible sodomy case. Bryson is alluding to a lot of other things that went on to that house, that evidence that he saw. Well, during this time, Berdella arrives home, and the officers that are waiting for him take him into custody. They call down the sex crime. Sex crime says, yeah, bring him on down. We'll book him on a 20-hour hold, and we'll start working on a search warrant, because we got to see what's inside this house. A little bit later, just to prime you on what you're going to hear about from Sergeant Cole, because he's going to talk about going in his house. They find a repulsive chamber of horrors. It was filthy. There was a rotting flesh smell. There was dog feces smell. They had other repulsive things, like a rotting turkey carcass on the stove. It was just, it looked like a hoarder lived there, and it was just a real pit. One of those things, you see stuff that you can't unsee, and you smell smells that you can't unsmell after you go into a place like that. It's Final Four time, and Sergeant Troy Cole, the homicide unit, had just sat down, getting ready to watch the OU-KU basketball game. Now, Troy Cole was a friend of mine, and he was from Oklahoma, huge OU fan, and this is the Final Four, and he's really excited about wanting to watch a basketball game. But his phone rings, and he hears his Captain Winston, say, we've got some evidence of a homicide, or maybe even multiple homicides, and you got to come back to work. Comes on back. What had happened was out at the hospital when the sex crimes detectives were questioning him, he said that Berdella had showed him some bunch of Polaroid pictures while he was being held prisoner. And he said he looked at him, he said, looked like they were being tortured. Some of them looked like they were dead. And he said, Berdella told him, he says, if you become a nuisance or a threat to me at any time, you see what's happened to these guys, that and more is going to happen to you. And you may be killed. Synova, why would a guy committing a crime like that take like 300 some, I don't remember, bunch of Polaroid photos and then keep them around and use them like that? Why do you think they do that?
Well, I believe when you're talking about Robert Berdella, that you've got at least two mental disorders that are kind of combined. And one of them is SSD, which is sexual sadistic disorder. And basically, that is someone that they have a different brain function, that they literally get off and get aroused by seeing pain in other people. And then they have a severe, they really want to dominate that person. They don't have, they want to cause as much pain to that person as possible, because that's what gives them that sexual pleasure. So you have someone who has a really heightened state of the amygdala part of the brain, which is the fear center, and that where you get real strong passion, you get the amygdala overfiring. But what couples with that makes it so scary is the anterior, it's called the anterior insula. Now, that part of the brain is what processes the pain centers of the brain. So when that one is overstimulated, that is what actually arouses the amygdala, which gives them the sexual arousal. So what happens is you have someone who their amygdala doesn't normally function to the point of normal. So they see, someone that they find attractive, then normally there might be a little bit of an arousal there. They see someone, in a swimsuit or something, that visual that they see, that would normally arouse that person. Well, in this situation, the amygdala doesn't fire that way. It doesn't work that way. So it actually has less function in a normal capacity. It needs that other part of the brain to overstimulate by seeing pain or causing pain. And then that will stimulate that sexual arousal. So that's where it is a little bit of a technical thing, but it is, couple that with, I think, the other mental disorder that we're talking about antisocial personality disorder. Now that you think, well, that just means they're a loner, but that's not it. That is kind of the overarching title for psychopathy and sociopathy. You take a psychopath and you couple that with the sexual sadism, and you've got a very dangerous, deadly human being. So the reason why he is taking 300 photos is because he needs that stimulation to get his normal fix, and he can't get it any other way. So he takes a picture, because the longest time that he had his sick fun was for up to 6 weeks. He kept one of his victims alive for 6 weeks. So he had his arousal for 6 weeks. And then that person died, and he did all of the horrible things afterwards to the body, which leans you back towards the psychopathy. And then it's over. And he's left back at that lower level, not able to reach any kind of arousal. So he's got 300 photos now that all he has to do is look through them. He remembers, he sees, he gets that visual stimulation, and it goes and it starts the process over, and it keeps him active until he gets to the next victim. So I believe he's got two different personality disorders that we're dealing with here. The psychopathy is what gives him no empathy. He doesn't care about consequences. He doesn't, he's very manipulative. You know, he manipulates people into his house, into his space. He's also got that just a little bit of a facade of not necessarily charm, but something enough to hide his darkness a little bit. Because what scared me the most when I read this case the first time, he was on the crime watch for his local community. And he also called and was trying to get to where he could mentor young boys. And so he had a little bit of a charm there that he could kind of manipulate his way into getting more victims. But I think those two disorders are probably why he would keep such notes, and he would keep 300 photographs.
Yeah, I was reading up on these, like Dahmer, he kept skulls, body parts, and some photos.
Yeah.
They said he got some sexual pleasure in keeping those body parts.
Yeah.
There's another guy,
and he
Ed Gein.
he needed that. That's part of the domination. He needs the full domination. That's the reason why he actually got into cannibalism, because he wanted to completely consume that other human being.
I see.
That's part of the sexual sadism, that complete and utter domination of another person.
You know, that Ed Gein from up north, what was he, Minnesota or Wisconsin? He's the one that made lampshades and pieces of furniture out of human flesh. And
out of his mother too.
Out of his mother, the old movie Psycho was kind of based on that.
Yeah.
A couple other guys. I thought there's a guy that collected high heels, a guy named James Lloyd. There's a guy called the Backpack Killer that he kept sleeping bags that belonged to his victims. It's just, you know, they, like I said, they're like trophies, and these were his trophies. He didn't really, you know, he did have some body parts where they weren't anything like what Dahmer did. He mainly got rid of, as we learned before, he cut the bodies up and got rid of all that evidence, but he kept those pictures. So it's,
well, to me, that shows a little bit more of the psychopathy of him. Versus if you get into psychopath versus sociopath, is more emotional and gets caught a little easier because they don't think things through. They're not as manipulative. So he knew enough that he was going to get rid of everything he could of that actual body, but then he still had that urge. He had to keep a trophy. So, but I didn't read anywhere. Did he keep all 6 skulls? I thought he just kept 2.
No, he just kept 2. He had one buried in the backyard,
and his favorites.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah, I think so.
Right.
Did that answer your question? Because I can go off on a tangent on that stuff.
I think I got it now. Anyhow, so on the afternoon that Christopher Bryson escaped, he's arrested. He'd have to get a search warrant there. He won't sign a consent to search, of course. But once they get inside, they find evidence that Bryson had been restrained and tortured. They found, he said that he was able to burn through the ropes that were binding him to a bed on the 2nd floor. Well, they find a bed on the 2nd floor, and they find ropes attached to the headboard and the baseboard, and they've been burnt through. They found an electrical transformer plugged into the wall with wires leading to the bed. That's never a good sign. Found a metal tray with syringes and small bottles with prescription drugs, swabs, eye drops close to the bed, just like they had talked about, where he would inject them with different things and put stuff, you know, put ammonia in eyes and do things like that. Also found a long iron pipe. There's various lengths of ropes and leather belts, and it looked like to the investigators that were first got in there, entered that room, that the posts on that bed were worn pretty good, where those bindings, like people had been pulling at those bindings a lot, kind of suggested to them that this had been going on for a while, and other people had tried to free themselves. So here's a comment from Homicide Sergeant Troy Cole on what they ran into that first day that they walked in. So searching around the house and grounds there, it's 4315 Charlotte for you people, and the house is no longer there, but it's 4315 Charlotte in Kansas City, Missouri. The investigators will uncover a human skull inside a closet on the 2nd floor of the property. And then when they start going into the yard, I remember they first brought a backhoe in. We'll talk about that in a minute. And they also brought all the recruits from the academy out, and they just like went over that whole, all the grounds there, you know, with like a screwdriver, a trowel or something, and just dug up a little bit looking for anything they could find. And they did find some human vertebrae And they said they were scarred by it looked like a saw and knife marks, and they found some human teeth in an envelope inside the house. They found a hacksaw, a miter saw, and a chainsaw in the basement that looked to be soiled with blood stains, maybe has some flesh on it, and they found some pubic hairs in them. They luminol the basement, and they found blood all over the place. There's 2 plastic trash barrels. Blood had been cleaned out. You couldn't see it without the luminol, but there was blood everywhere. And they will eventually find these Polaroid pictures that Bryson had said, Berdella showed him and said, you don't want to end up like this. So we've talked a little bit about Berdella's need to control. I was looking up on that need to control. We all have a certain need to control. Let's discuss that a little bit, Synova. Could have been previous traumatic events in his life. Maybe we talked about his parents. His dad was pretty strict. They weren't rageaholics. They weren't mentally ill. Maybe it could have been a chemical imbalance in his brain that causes, like he's out of control and he has to frantically find somebody to keep under his control.
I think, it always goes back to the nature versus nurture question. And I always find that it's a little bit of both. He shows to me more tendency to be psychopathic instead of sociopathic. Psychopathic is born, sociopathic is learned. So it makes me think that it's not all learned behavior. He did have a difficult childhood, but nothing more than what other people have had. So you can't necessarily say that his childhood was that traumatic, but I look at it and you have someone that's already got the hard wiring in their brains a little bit skewed anyways. And then you have to understand that trauma doesn't actually happen to you physically. And you'll get some people backlash that. And I'm like, trauma is what happens to you, your perception of it. So technically, you see people that go through a lot of physical hardships, and yet they don't have that mental trauma. And then other people that seem to go through things that maybe aren't as difficult, and yet they're just traumatized, so mentally messed up with it, that it takes them years to recover. So trauma is actually your perception of things. So you have to go back and look at this child who is the firstborn of a somewhat domineering father. You can tell by some of the things that they said about him, but he has a younger brother who seems to live up more to the father's expectations. So you have an older brother who's nearly blind, who I noticed one thing that I really caught my eye. He had a speech impediment, but he was pretty intellectual. He wasn't, he had a fairly decent IQ. So we're not talking someone with a low IQ. So those 2 things right there are traumatic. You've got someone with a decent IQ who can't communicate. And now that's going to cause problems no matter what you do. And then you add on the fact that he was blind, he wasn't athletic, so he couldn't live up to his father's expectations. Then his father dies at a very pivotal point in his life. And then his mother remarries. He could never understand how she could dare to do that. So I'm thinking all of those things played into his concept of his childhood trauma. Because whether, we like to look back there and say, okay, well, his mom beat him with a headless chicken and threw him in a closet. I know of a case that they did that, and that was the traumatic event. But in his case, you can't find one major traumatic event of child abuse. Losing your father as a preteen or a teenager, that's traumatic, but you can't find necessarily a lot of abuse in there. So I think the fact that he couldn't communicate well, the fact he couldn't live up to his father, the fact that he's also got a lot. He decided that he was homosexual, but he was also a religious family, a Roman Catholic religious family. So that goes against what he's taught religiously. So he doesn't say anything and really come out publicly about that until he's, a young adult. So he's got years of sexual tension on top of that. So I think all of that, coupled with his little bit of a skewed brain's hardwiring there, I think all of that combined is what made him, he couldn't control anything, or he felt like he couldn't. So he had to find that somewhere. And so he took it out on people that were, victims, and anybody that he thought was less than, somebody that he thought he could take over real easy. He didn't go after men his own size, his own capabilities. He went after, children, teenagers that were runaways or drug addicts or, sex workers or somebody that he felt like he could dominate easily. So he had that bit of an inferiority complex going in there as well. So I hope I
Yeah.
answered the question. I could go.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have to just tell me to shut up when you're ready. It's
Yeah.
like, okay,
No,
Synova, I
it's
got it.
yeah. So, go back, they found, I've actually found the exact number, 334 Polaroid pictures. And there was
Wow.
34 snapshot prints of various men that they believed were either dead or being tortured. On the second floor of the house, they found it up underneath a bed, like it was kind of being hid. They found torture instruments, the bindings on the bed, as I said before, and other suspicious objects like the transformer and those things like that. It was set up to be a torture chamber, there's no doubt about it. And as the detectives are looking at these pictures, for example, they see one photo with his hands tied behind his back to a short kind of a board or a stick, and he's got some what do you call those, alligator clips on him, like he's being shocked, and he's straining. You can see him straining so much that every muscle and tendon in his body seem to be popping out. I mean, it's a horrible picture, and it's like, if something really bad happened here, and but you don't know, you don't even know who any of these guys are, and they're
Can you
not.
imagine being the officer on that? You've got 334 photos of a crime, and yet you have no idea who these people are or where to find them or how to find them. Or, I mean, I can't imagine what the officers thought when they walked into this. I mean,
Yeah, I can't either.
I bet they didn't sleep for years, nightmares and all that. I mean,
Really.
I study all this, but I don't have to do the hands-on seeing the crime.
You don't have to.
I'll see crime scene photos, but there's still that little bit of a displacement there. I don't actually go into the crime scenes and see it. I can't imagine what kind of trauma just the officers went through trying to go through all those photos.
Really.
I mean,
so now this house, speaking of the search, this house, and I mentioned this before, over the next few days, they spend several days in this house, and they search the grounds, and then they get the backhoe out there, and they find a suspicious grave-shaped disturbance in the yard. So let's listen to Sergeant Cole talk about this suspicious plot that they found in the backyard. Well, interesting. About the second scoopful, they come up and there comes a head rolling out. I mean, I can't even imagine it, what that'd have to feel like to see that head rolling out. I saw a few things on the job myself, but nothing ever really quite like that. It's just, it's something, and like, you've got all this, finally, you've got a couple of other pieces of evidence of murder, but the pictures aren't near enough. And the first thing you have to do with like that head they dug up, and with that other skull they find, you have to figure out, well, how old are these? Berdella was a antique collector. How these could have been something that people traded around in the antique world and that he bought. I mean, he could claim that. So first thing they did is get a forensic, not a psychologist, but a doctor, to a pathologist, to then try to date these things. And the lucky thing is the skull had been boiled clean inside. It looked like, it was hard to tell how old it was. But this thing outside, the skull they found outside, had a lot of hair and flesh and everything attached to it. So it was a lot easier to determine that this was real recent. This is enough to charge him with some kind of a murder, but then, it would still be the weight of the entire evidence, because you don't have any witnesses. You don't have, you've got those pictures, but you can't really link that skull to any one particular person, which is something we're going to talk a little more about, is how they identified these people, because it was a tough thing to do.
He's removing the teeth. So that's going to make it hard. That's going to make it hard for them to identify in the 80s. I mean, because that was one of the main things they did was dental records. So, I mean, we're talking someone that has a pretty high intelligence to be able to think on these things and say, I'm going to remove the teeth to make this harder on them. I'm going to put the bodies here and dispose of the bodies here to make it harder for them to find. So you're talking to someone who has thought this process out,
Yeah.
who has fantasized this for a long time. And he just finally found his first victim and to continue this. What did they say? It was 2 years over 2 years that he was doing this.
Yeah, I think so. I think 2 or 3 years he'd been doing this quite a
Yeah.
while. You have
Well,
to
if it
wonder,
wasn't for
like,
the photographs, I bet we would have had 3 times as many victims. But the photographs were kind of holding him over in between times, is why
yeah,
I think we got 6 instead of 30.
yeah, that was my question. So you think the photos then held him over? He would maybe masturbate, get out those photos and recreate those feelings and maybe masturbate and
Yeah.
relieve his tension during those with that.
I think so. And then you said, you talked about the gruesomeness of the one photo where his muscles were popping out and his veins and all that. You'd think and this is a crude example, but a girl looking at a bodybuilder and he's got all the muscles and the veins, and that's attractive to a female. Some of them I think they get too huge and it's grotesque.
That's what my wife says.
You think of it that way. That is something that would trigger, oh hey, that's nice, might have some kind of attraction feeling there. And he was doing that with this human being's picture of him killing this human being and shocking him, and so he's looking at that in a sexual manner, of all those muscles popping out and the tendons, and it kind of gives you an insight of how sick and sadistic this person was. I mean, because he's
Really?
getting off on those little details that we see and are so appalled by.
Interesting. So the next thing we're going to talk about in the next episode is about how they start identifying these young men, because you had to do it. And you got to understand is immediately there's not like a whole bunch of missing young men that have been reported in Kansas City and everybody's all up in the air. Well, what happened to this young guy? What happened to that young guy? There's not been any kind of an outcry of any young men disappearing like that, because they all were basically street kids and disassociated from their families because of their lifestyle or whatever, their drug use, and they've been on the streets a lot and just surf couches and slept out underneath the bridge, and then maybe got enough money to get some kind of a cheap motel room and do some drugs for a while and then hit the streets again. And there was no real connection between Berdella and his victim. This Chris Bryson, he had, that they could tell, he did have some kind of a connection to Bryson, where he knew somebody that knew him, and Bryson was doing some prostitution work. And so that's, they knew then how they got together. And, by then they knew that he was what we call a chicken hawk, which is a homosexual man who goes out and finds young drug addicts working the street prostitutes and just trying to get drug money. And so you got to start working that. And I remember in the intelligence unit, that was one thing that myself and another guy did, is we went out and just started hitting those places where those kids were and start asking them, okay, who does this? Who are these guys? And of course, they're pretty suspicious at first, but we finally convinced some of them to talk to us. And man, I found the guy that had a grocery store about 3 blocks from my house at the time, had a little corner store that I like to use. And I knew it was weird. Well, he was one of them. I remember this guy I'd come in the store and he knew I was a copper, and he'd say, Gary, he said, I had this young man that I'm trying to help out downtown, and I was giving him a ride home, and it looked like he just lives in a drug den. It's just horrid what's going on out there with drugs and everything. And I remember thinking, well, what the hell, Kelly, what are you doing that for? Even talked about one tried to rob him, and he pulled his gun out and shot up in the air, and the kid ran off. So, don't tell me that stuff. And I find out, that's what he did. It never even entered my mind back then, that because he was like a neighborhood guy and everybody knew him. And of course he wasn't killing people like Berdella was, but he was one of those guys, and identified 2 or 3 others, a couple of really rich guys that were doing that. So it was there's a whole subculture out there in every major city of these young men that are doing that. They made a whole movie about it called Train Spotting, I think, with Ewan McGregor. I don't know if they've done any since. I think they have. My Private Idaho, I think, one is about that subculture.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting subculture and not one that I never really wanted to know anything about.
No, no, and the thing with it is when you disassociate yourself from all of those people that you think or maybe have too many rules for you, or you know, want to control you or whatever, when you disassociate yourself from that, you open yourself up to people like that, you know, because those people that are trying to control you are most of the time, you know, parents that are trying to keep you out of harm's way, you know, and so when you disassociate yourself from that, it not only puts you in a bad spot, but then it also makes it hard for people to find you, you know. So if you do become a victim, you know, like in this situation, you know, there's nobody really reporting these people because they don't know where these people are. You know, they
Yeah.
don't have any family or friends or anybody to know that they're missing, or the few friends that they have are in the criminal element and they're not going to talk to the cops about anything.
Right.
You know, so
Yeah.
it's a bad situation to get yourself in for a lot of different reasons.
Really. Okay, Synova, let's wind this up, and people come back next week, and we're going to learn about Berdella and what happened after they started filing charges on him, and when he gets faced with the death penalty, what the detectives found as they tried to identify these different people. It's just it's a crazy story. I know that, and it's one that in a way I just as soon not know about. But I think everybody, you know, these things happen, you know, so you need to know about it. If you have young kids like this, you see it, some relative of yours is hits the streets like that, because that can happen in any family. Believe me, drug addiction can happen in any family, and they hit the streets like that, you know, at least try to keep up with them, kind of try to find out where they are, because they really live a really risky life. I mean, it's just so risky being on the streets like that.
It is.
Okay. Like I said, I'll add something else in. Let's do, okay, we're starting back up here again. Okay, welcome back, guys. This is the fourth and final episode to the Bob Berdella, Bob the Butcher story, the man, the serial, I will start over with that one again. Welcome back, everybody. This is the fourth and final episode. If you haven't listened to 1, 2, and 3, you need to listen to those before you start listening to this. You really got to get caught up. So at this point in time, a little recap here. You know, Bob Berdella was a serial killer that killed, raped, killed, tortured 6 young men in his house in Kansas City during the 1980s. One of them gets away. A kid named Christopher Bryson was able to get away, and he got police picked him up, and they served a search warrant on the house and found a lot of evidence in there. And they found 364 Polaroid pictures, 30 of which were 30-some, which looked like people were bound, being tortured, or were dead. There's one where a man is straining against these bindings so hard that you can see every muscle and tendon in his body about to pop out. And he had like an alligator clip on him. And, you know, part of the allegation from the man that got away was that he was using electrical shocks to torture people, and other things, cucumbers to sodomize them, and crazy stuff like that. They found a torture log that indicated some of those things had been happening. And these pictures, they found a recently buried skull in the backyard, found some other bits and pieces of bones inside the house. They found one picture of a body hanging over some basement rafters over a tub, but they couldn't see the actual face on it. But from what Sergeant Cole said, the homicide sergeant was there, he said the liver or the blood, you can see in the photo that the blood had all drained down to the extremities, and it only happens after you're dead. And so they're pretty sure that guy was dead. They know that this recently deposited skull in the backyard was a recent murder, but they had a problem. They had to find out who these kids were, because right now they're just missing, and they're not listed as missing. So they start a task force, and they all show up in the what they call the lineup room. It's just kind of a large room just off of the second floor where all the detectives have offices and where they run lineups. And that's where a lot of cops just come through there all the time. So Troy told me that when they got in there, then they heard about, all the other cops heard about these pictures. All these cops start screaming down there wanting to see these pictures. Everybody wants to see. If you find some dirty movies or dirty pictures or something like this, you're going to have cops showing up and wanting to see it so they could go home, go back and brag to their friends. So Troy went to his captain, then he went to an off-site location and a quieter location, and the news people weren't coming, didn't know where they were, and they weren't coming around because they like to keep a damper on the news media till they get some feel for what's going on. And so they make copies of these photos and they send out two-person teams, and they go to halfway houses and drug and alcohol recovery centers. They go to the Salvation Army and any of the other shelters. They go to the downtown bus station, like where I'd been going, trying to find out who the different men were that were doing this kind of thing, picking up these kids off the streets, and start showing those photos to the street kids. And they start getting partial names and nicknames and street names, maybe a full name once in a while, but it won't be anybody you ever heard of. And there might be somebody from outside of Kansas City, so they even have a criminal record in Kansas City. You couldn't even run them in the computer. It was just, they had a guy down at the lab that spent hours looking at these photographs, trying to find scars and birthmarks and different kinds of things that would identify these kids. So he decided, the guy that did that decided there's about 21 or 22 different people in the photographs. So now they start trying to run them down, and they had the two skulls. So they try to find, then they can, maybe back then they could use some DNA if they could find out who that was and then match it to the skull. Find relatives and things like that, and get some DNA. And I think you could even do that back then. Eventually they'll find everybody alive, 22 people. They find all alive but 6. There's 6 they can never ever find, and they finally eventually will put those 6 names to those people. So now they're kind of ready to do some legal maneuvering. The public defender is defending Berdella. And I mentioned before, I think I mentioned that he was scared he would be, if he went to the penitentiary, he was scared he would be killed. He had reason to, because Paul Howe, who was the father of the very first victim, Jerry Howe, had planned to go into the courtroom with a gun, but he couldn't get through security. He goes without a gun. He jumps the rails and the rail between the audience and the lawyers up front and attacked Berdella. So it was, it was a crazy time. A lot of headlines during this. You know how that is, Synova. When you get a horrific crime like this, why the newspapers are all over it. And anytime something like that happens, it's going to be a big headline. They're going to get in and ask more questions.